Good afternoon, and welcome back to the friendly confines of the JPC. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. Last time, as many of you know, we were remote, and it was a little bit strange, but our guest was interesting. And if you weren't with us, I encourage you to go to our website and download the conversation with Or Issachar of the Israel Defense and Security Forum. He was really good. Our guest today, auspiciously because today is Law Day as well as May Day, is Ilya Shapiro, Senior Fellow and Director of Constitutional Studies at the Manhattan Institute. He is here, A, because he's terrific. He's also here because B, I am confused. Over the past few months, what's become clear is that people with experience, people with no experience, people with political axes to grind, people who know a little bit, people who know nothing, people who want to make a point, they're all opining on immigration, visas, deportation, masking policy, not to mention the role of the judicial branch of our government with respect to the executive branch. So I need an expert. You need an expert. We need Ilya Shapiro. But first, your JPC commercial. I'll give you the short form today. The JPC was established in 1985. You can find us on our website at jewishpolicycenter.org. You can find our insight articles, our magazine, In Focus Quarterly. The spring issue of In Focus is up now. It's our domestic issue. And there is an article in it by Ilya Shapiro on masking policy. Take a look at our newly revamped In Context section as well. You can find all of these plus our webinar programming at, excuse me, jewishpolicycenter.org. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. And since October 7th in particular, we support the government of Israel and the IDF in their determination to secure the borders and the people of Israel from the malign forces in their neighborhood. We advocate for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, free speech, and intellectual diversity. Those last two are, I suspect, the reasons that Ilya Shapiro is a member of our Board of Fellows, which is the most important part of his bio, but I will give you the rest. Ilya is, as I mentioned, a senior fellow and director of constitutional studies at the Manhattan Institute. Previously, he was executive director and senior lecturer at Georgetown University's Center for the Constitution, and before that, vice president of the Cato Institute and director of Cato's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies. He is the author of Lawless. Wait, where's Lawless? Here you go. He is the author of Lawless, The Miseducation of America's Elites, which came out just now, and I've just started reading, and for which I will have a review in Focus in the future, but don't wait for me. Get it and read it yourself. He is also the author of Supreme Disorder, Judicial Nominations, and the Politics of America's Highest Court, which was published in 2020, and also reviewed for In Focus. He has testified before Congress, before state legislatures, and he's filed more than 500 amicus curiae friend of the court briefs in the Supreme Court. He has appeared in every publication you think he should and appears frequently on the media. And you can read his Shapiro's Gavel newsletter on Substack. I strongly recommend that. He once appeared on the Colbert Report, too, and I think somebody out there should ask him about that. He holds degrees from Princeton University, the London School of Economics, and his JD is from the University of Chicago Law School. Ilya Shapiro, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks to be back with you, Shoshana. Thanks for the invite. Thanks for in advance reviewing my book. Only if it's a good review. If it's not a good review, then no thanks at all. So I know there's going to be lots of questions about different legal things. I mean, lots of executive orders flying around, lots of court actions. Happy to deal with all that in Q&A. What I want to present to you is about my book, and which is about the state of higher education, the crisis in higher education, and specifically legal education. And I focused in my book on legal education, law schools, the legal profession, not just because I happen to be a lawyer, but because as bad, as sad as it might be, for an English or a sociology department to go off the rails. Law schools produce the gatekeepers of our legal and political institutions. And so if young lawyers are trained that, for example, there's no objective truth and all issues need to be viewed through lenses of race, gender, and other identity categories, and all of our institutions need to be rebuilt according to a different privilege hierarchy or intersectional matrix, that is not good, to say the least, for the pillars on which American liberty, equality, prosperity stand. The whole rule of law is in jeopardy. And I think there's now a national realization that there's a crisis in higher education. It was really thrust into the public discourse, into the national discourse after October 7th. As Bill Ackman, the Harvard donor and activist, put it in an essay that was published the same day that Claudine Gay resigned the presidency of that institution, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine, a warning about larger issues. It's a leading indicator of underlying pathologies, which here means everything from cancel culture to ideological indoctrination, intellectual corruption to moral decay. We've seen a subversion of the core mission of universities to seek truth and knowledge, and of classical liberal values like free speech, due process, equality under the law. It's been a shift from education to activism. Your rights and freedoms depend on whether you're part of a class deemed oppressor or oppressed. Now, some, like, say, Erwin Chemerinsky, Dean of Berkeley Law, wrote in the aftermath of October 7th that as a 70-year-old Jewish man, quote, "Never in my life have I seen or felt the anti-Semitism of the last few weeks," unquote. Well, some of us were less surprised given the anti-Israel, anti-American, and generally anti-Western ideology that's taken root in higher education. Indeed, some of us have a lived experience with this sort of thing. 3 years ago, when I tried to talk about the themes that ended up being part of my book at UC Law SF, the school formerly known as UC Hastings, the response I got there was basically shut up. It was like an Occupy Wall Street meeting with chanting and banging, and the event was a complete shutdown. The first time I'd ever had anything like it in more than 1,000 public speaking events. This had something to do with my Georgetown troubles, as it were, the Twitter controversy, for which I was investigated, and I mean that whole thing, which I imagine most of you on this Zoom are familiar, but you can read about it in my book, at my Substack. Just it's all there. But regardless, I still maintain that President Biden should have considered all possible candidates for his Supreme Court seat, as 76% of Americans agreed in a poll by that right-wing outlet, ABC News. But anyway, what I saw at Hastings at UC Law SF was not unique, not even for that month of March of 2022. The following thing, a similar thing happened at Yale, ironically over a panel bringing together lawyers from the left and right who agreed on little other than the importance of free speech. Then it happened at Michigan when students obstructed a debate on Texas's heartbeat bill. And then a year later, now 2 years ago, was the shutdown of Judge Kyle Duncan at Stanford. The only thing that these events had in common was that they featured non-progressive speakers. We've gotten to a place where questioning, say, affirmative action or abortion is outside the academic Overton window, the acceptable range of policy views. Now, it's all well and good to adopt strong speech policies, but it's not enough if administrators aren't willing to stand up to those who demand censorship. Proliferating DEI offices enforce an orthodoxy that, contrary to the positive or even healthy dictionary definitions of those three words, diversity, equity, inclusion, stifle intellectual diversity, undermine equal opportunity, and exclude dissenting voices. Now, Georgetown reinstated me, clearing me on the technicality that I wasn't an employee when I made my offensive tweet. But the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Affirmative Action, IDEA, set me up for discipline the next time I transgressed progressive orthodoxy. They said that if I said something offensive again, then I'd be back in the Inquisition. And instead of participating in that slow motion firing, I quit and have been using this platform I've been given that I didn't ask for ever since to shine a light on the rot in academia. Now, I'm generally optimistic about America. Like Brett Kavanaugh, if you remember from his confirmation hearings before it descended into even more chaos. He talked about living on the sunrise side of the mountain. I'm generally there for society writ large. But we may have passed the point of no return in terms of the illiberal takeover of higher education. And I do mean illiberal. What we're seeing is not just the latest iteration of the decades old conservative complaint about liberal professors. The Berkeley hippies, who took over the faculty lounge, that free speech movement in the 60s would now be considered retrograde white supremacy. And the weak leaders at these educational institutions placate that illiberal left that drives campus culture. University officials facilitate and even foment social justice mobs, with everyone else keeping their heads down so as not to be caught in the cancellation crossfire. And while we talk a lot about ideology and its failures, and I'll get to a little bit more on that, there's this less sexy aspect, which is the growing bureaucracies that's contributed largely to what we've seen. The statistics on the growth of these left-skewed non-teaching staff are mind-boggling. In the quarter century ending 2010, before what I would call the mania of the last 10, 15 years, administrative positions swelled by 60%, a rate of growth 10 times that of tenured faculty. Twice the rate of growth of students, while tuition more than tripled. Now, uniform statistics since then are harder to come by. It's harder to make apples to apples comparisons, but suffice it to say, the growth in bureaucracies has far outpaced that in faculties and student bodies. And these trends are particularly acute in so-called elite places. Yale's administration ballooned by nearly 50% from 2003 to 21, 3 times faster than that of the undergraduate student body. At Stanford, the number of administrators grew by 30% from 2017 to 22 alone. So the school now has twice as many non-teaching staff as undergrads, 6 times the number of administrators as faculty. The joke is that 100 years ago, Yaleys came to campus with their own personal butlers. Well, now maybe the goal is to provide each student with their own personal butler again. But in effect, students and families are paying a lot more to subsidize a class of well-paid bureaucrats who, whatever the faults are with professors, which are many, and university hiring bias and all of that, administrators are much more radical. A 2018 survey found that faculty have a liberal to conservative ratio of about 6-1. Now, you take out the engineering schools, the economics department, the business schools, that ratio is even more skewed. But regardless, overall 6-1, while administrators are 12-1, with 40% self-identifying as far left. What once were technocratic paper pushers ensuring compliance with regulations have morphed into enforcers of racialism and gender ideology. And of course, their incentive, as bureaucrats' incentive is in the public sector and the nonprofit sector, wherever, is to justify and expand their authority and their budgets. And that's exactly what's happened here, as apparatchiks with no connection to teaching, not steeped in values of academic freedom or scholarship, chill speech and eviscerate due process. And in the last 15 years, most of that bureaucratic growth has been in DEI. A 2021 survey of 65 large universities, basically the old Power 5 football conferences. College football is a little different now, but 65 large schools representing 16% of all students at four-year institutions found that the average school had more than 45 people devoted full-time to DEI, which is more than the average number of history professors. At the University of Michigan, 261 people full-time authority over DEI, double that if you include part-time, at a cost of more than $30 million a year. Now, imagine if you'd spent that money on scholarships for underprivileged kids or tutoring support or something like that. But no, it goes to these programs, or at least it did. The jury's out now. What's going on? Obviously, the Trump administration has put out lots of directives and funds are threatened. Universities are renaming their DEI centers, reshuffling their staff. We'll see how all that turns out. But in any event, at least until January, DEI staffs were on average 4 times larger than those that provide legally mandated accommodations to students with disabilities. And I should make clear, this survey, this count that I've been giving you, excludes people whose primary role is in Title IX, equal employment opportunity, other legal obligations according to federal and state civil rights law. So none of this DEI metrics that I gave you is legally required. And an inordinate number of these offices, you won't be surprised to learn, have been created or filled in the last decade, especially since the racial reckoning, so-called, set off by the murder of George Floyd. And the sad or ironic thing about this is these DEI structures fail on their own terms. Campus climate surveys show that student satisfaction or feelings of belonging generally, or comfort with racial diversity or other kinds of diversity specifically, are inversely correlated with the size and budgets of DEI offices. So the real danger, even beyond just money or bureaucratic bloat, tuition explosion, student loan issues, etc., is that universities no longer focus on free inquiry and pursuit of knowledge. Instead, they deploy this army of non-teaching educrats that either distracts from that mission by providing therapeutic coddling or actively prevents truth-seeking by enforcing an ideological orthodoxy. Having staff hold students' hands, organize their social lives, help them process the trauma of election results that don't go their way, infantilizes the young adults that should be training for the workplace in the public square. Having staff organize trainings, rallies, struggle sessions to enforce narrow perspectives on race, sex, class, prevents the development of critical thinking skills that students need to become well-adjusted professionals. Think about it in the legal context. To be a good lawyer, you need to understand all arguments around a particular issue. Well, if half of those arguments are illegitimate, if certain topics can't even be raised because they're triggering, you're not going to have very good lawyers. And by the way, this dynamic also shifts power away from faculty and gives it to political commissars whose goals diverge from long-held higher ed values. DEI offices have broadened terms like harassment and discrimination, as well as therapeutic terms like harm and safety, not to promote equal opportunity or a welcoming campus environment, but to enforce progressive ideology. The behavior of Stanford's DEI dean in egging on the mob against Judge Duncan was illustrative of how these regimes are antithetical to universities' basic missions. And then there's the shift from education to indoctrination. You know, when I was in law school in the early 2000s, which sometimes feels like just yesterday and sometimes feels like another planet a long time ago, but when I was in law school, critical legal studies with all of its Hegelian, culturally Marxist discourse, that was a spent force. You know, we'd heard about it. We knew it as something from the 80s and 90s that, you know, had become niche theory with no direct application, maybe relegated to some dark corner of the sociology department. But now the crits are back, and not just in literature or sociology. Regardless of what's going on in K-12 or even undergraduate teaching, Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw have eclipsed William Blackstone and Louis Brandeis as avatars of legal education. And that shift, when coupled with the bureaucratic growth I've discussed, has led institutions to prioritize activism over inquiry, seeking social justice rather than truth. So I'm pessimistic that anything will change at any school where academic freedom isn't supported, where rules against hecklers' vetoes, takeovers of academic buildings, encampments that block student access aren't followed. Too few administrators follow the example of the late University of Chicago president, Bob Zimmer, who, when pressured to punish a professor who had criticized the university's affirmative action policy, said, look, I'm not in the speech police business. If you don't like something that a faculty member says, write a letter to the editor, do a blog post, have a protest, whatever, but don't come to me. Too few university leaders follow the lead of Daniel Diermeyer, chancellor at Vanderbilt, who ejected and expelled students who had taken over his office. I mean, this is a very low bar for getting national acclaim, just enforcing your own very basic rules. And indeed, wherever leaders stand up for the core mission of any academic institution, the mob disperses. But most presidents and deans are spineless cowards. They're not woke radicals. They're careerists who climb the greasy pole, responding to their incentives that they face, and they're unwilling to confront the illiberal inmates who've taken over their institutions. So statements about academic freedom, declining to fire Supreme Court justices. You might recall Justice Thomas resigned or withdrew from teaching a class that he had long taught at GW. That's not enough. These leaders must instill a culture of respect for opposing views. And that means dismantling these bureaucracies that undermine classical liberal values, ending loyalty oaths in the form of diversity statements. Presidents and deans are very good at instilling whatever values they want: public service, social justice, entrepreneurship, whatever. And they can do that for open inquiry and civil discourse. Now, when I left Georgetown, I wasn't holding my breath at the prospect of reform. But maybe now we're finally seeing a backlash to our illiberal inquisitors. I'm still not sure it can all be done from within. So I'm grateful for the external controls that we're seeing from state legislators and attorneys general, congressional oversight tied to federal funding, now administrative pressure, investigations of various kinds. And we can talk about that in Harvard's lawsuit and things like that. And we also need exogenous shocks like Judge Ho's boycott of Yale and Stanford for clerk hiring, and now Columbia as well. Plus employers shying away from hiring those who support Hamas or who yell at federal judges that they hope their daughters are raped. And we need public exposure. My now colleague John Saylor has done a great job using Freedom of Information Act requests to show how different universities, public universities, have been using diversity statements for hiring of economists and biologists and things like this. Every now and again, just a simple op-ed will pop up from him in the Wall Street Journal. And the very next day, the university president, chastened, will say, this is not appropriate. We're not going to do that anymore. Claudine Gay, Harvard's former president, crystallizes the larger problem. He's a mediocre academic who was elevated for advancing progressive orthodoxy while also checking intersectional boxes for identity. She's the apotheosis of an anti-intellectual movement that values DEI, identity, and activism over truth-seeking merit and education. And that movement is designed to prefer commissars over scholars. But her resignation doesn't end that university's troubles. All of these resignations of presidents that we've seen, Columbia, I think, is on its fourth in the last 2 years. But that's not enough. These schools are still plagued by toxic campus cultures, ideological corruption, bureaucratic bloat, all of which stifles open inquiry and free discourse. FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, recently named Harvard the worst school in the country for free speech for the second straight year. Well, Harvard may be the worst on that and other measures, but it's by no means alone. It doesn't take long to destroy reputations built over decades and centuries. The question now is whether these higher education grandees are willing to do the work, to use some of this postmodern theoretical speak, to restore their tarnished stature. There's still a long way to go before universities return to their mission of seeking truth and knowledge, and law schools return to their goal of teaching future lawyers to uphold the rule of law. But the battle's been joined. I'll stop there, and I look forward to answering or dodging your questions.
I'm not going to let you dodge. I'm going to try not to let you dodge. Okay. First of all, let me say I'm glad that you pointed out Vanderbilt. My son is a professor there. I always like to hear that at least somebody does something right. The second thing you said, or another thing you said, was that these administrators are careerists. So they're working hard to keep their jobs. They're working hard to go where the push is. The Trump administration's approach to Harvard and a lot of these other schools is a warning that federal funds are going to be cut off to schools that are something. Now, I have a couple of questions. On Monday, Columbia University students, faculty, and alumni launched a speak out to criticize not President Trump, but to criticize school leaders for bowing to the Trump administration's demands. So my first question, are the demands Trump administration demands, or are they demands of US law having to do with civil rights violations against students of those institutions? And secondly, because you don't sound very optimistic here, is the administration approach, which is to say, if you violate US law, in our view, we're going to cut off your money, could that push people in the right direction?
So first of all, when universities accept federal funds, they accept a whole lot of strings attached. That ranges from accounting standards to civil rights laws. And all federal funds are conditioned in that way. So there doesn't have to be a finding that, well, this grant is going to cancer research and it's those cancer researchers that are violating civil rights or engaging in bad accounting practices or what have you. So while it's unfortunate that, it's the humanities and social science people who are acting up and the bureaucrats, of course, at these institutions, while it's, the most of the funding that goes to the universities goes to scientific and medical research and what have you. But that's just a function of how these things have always worked. And so, there's a process for pausing and withholding funding of schools that violate their obligations under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, for example, to assure equal access to educational opportunity, whether in the anti-Semitism context or otherwise. Lots of due process violations with the enforcement of Title IX and sexual harassment allegations, for example. So there's, these issues did not start on October 7th. Universities have long gotten away with doing a whole host of things that are not just bad or we would find, morally wrong, but that are legally wrong, starting with racial discrimination in hiring and admissions, and continuing through lots of other practices. Now, the separate question about whether the way that the Trump administration has tried to remedy these problems is proper, either legally, strategically, tactically. Under the relevant statutes, if the federal government wants to pull back its funds because it sees violations of these grant contracts or of broader civil rights laws, then it has to investigate, it has to give notice that these are the violations that we found, has to give a chance to voluntarily remedy, and only then, once it sees that this isn't being remedied, does it take action. To say the least, that's not what's happened in the last 100 days. There have been investigations launched, to be sure, but there have also been demand letters before any report from these investigations has come out. And that's a negotiation tactic. It's not necessarily wrong or illegal. And Colombia does seem to have agreed to do certain things, although one of its presidents behind closed doors said that nothing will change and we just agreed to this, but doesn't have any teeth or something like that. So, there's continuing question about whether anything will come of that voluntarily through that kind of negotiation. There's also a question about whether the second Harvard letter, the April 11th letter, was even authorized to go out. Some reporting suggests that it wasn't, and negotiations had begun from a letter from the previous week, but now we're sort of down this path too far, and Harvard has sued, and that's kind of stopped or squelched any movement towards reform internally, and we're left to see what the judicial outcome is going to be. One final thing on this that I'll say is we don't know exactly what the demands are or what the violations are because these letters have not been detailed and precise. They're starting to be now. Now that finally we're like about a month into Harmeet Dillon having been confirmed as the head of DOJ Civil Rights, the last such letter that was sent out was to UVA, I think, earlier this week. And that is more lawyerly and detailed and things like that. So we'll see how it goes in the future. But the Harvard demand letter, the Harvard lawsuit, focuses on such things as demands for viewpoint diversity in every department. It's not clear what that means. Do we want an equal number of Republicans and Democrats in each department? Do we want different views, in the physics department on some abstruse aspect of quantum mechanics? I have no idea. Forget politically controversial stuff like climate science or something in the social science departments. But, what does that even mean? And then what is the civil rights or other hook on which the federal government is trying to tie that to? That, I think, is where it's on its legally weakest stand. Other things, like with respect to DEI offices or protecting women's rights in sports or certain other kinds of demands, the administration certainly can be tied and is tied, I think, to the civil rights laws, although again, not precisely spelled out in some of these demands.
So, is there a difference then, in your view, between the kind of DEI problem, which is to say, do we need diverse opinions in the political science department versus the biology department or whatever, and the harassment that students have undergone on college campuses since October 7th? Because it seems to me that one is something you can discuss. You can talk about how you feel about biology. But the harassment of Jewish students on campuses, which is fairly obvious since it's all videoed, um, is there a difference in approach to that? Are they different laws? Are they different requirements for the protection of physical bodies versus intellectual conversation?
Not necessarily. Well, I mean, viewpoint bias or ideological discrimination in hiring, whether it's in political science or in science. Like I said, some schools have hired scientists and economists based on diversity statements. So it's not just the area studies department or what have you. But there could be some legal claims there because the university advertises that it doesn't do these sorts of things, and then it starts doing them. So there may be some contract breach of contract claims by the people who weren't hired because of their political views, but unclear whether the federal government can really be involved. Although a lot of those viewpoint discriminatory actions are tied to race or national origin discrimination as well. So there's overlap sometimes, but yeah, certainly the failure to do anything about harassment or disruption of educational programs when the institutions don't do something about that, they're in explicit violation of their duties under Title VI.
So, is the process different then? If the president says if Jewish students are not permitted to enter certain places on campus, um, we have a different set of proof requirements for that? Is it faster to withhold money?
It's not proof requirements. I mean, the process is the same. You say that we found these violations, and are you going to remedy them? And if you don't, then you're going to lose your money. Um, so the federal government can't, if, for already contracted for funds, it can't act in a punitive way, like you did something 10 years ago or you did something last year. You've since fixed that, but that was so bad we're going to punish you. It generally can't do that. Again, there's different terms and different grants and contracts and things like that, but generally it can't do that. What it can do is look at forward-looking contracts and put certain programs under receivership as it's doing apparently with the Columbia Middle Eastern Studies Department, which it says is I think rightly one of the fonts of anti-Semitism and these civil rights violations on campus. But it's not a matter of one set of allegations are fast-tracked and others are not.
Okay, so you mentioned something else. I mean, all of this conversation so far has been about money. What about foreign money? There are reporting requirements for foreign money, and it appears at least that some of the institutions, at least, did not properly report the foreign money. What's the penalty for that? I mean, we've got Chinese money, we've got Qatari money. Uh,
Um, my colleague Nitu Arnold at the Manhattan Institute has done a lot of work on this. I just will commend her reporting to that. But yeah, there are consequences, fines and penalties for not adhering to your disclosure requirements for foreign money, which has exploded in the last decade. This is definitely something new. Those of us who are more than 10 years out of college, you don't realize exactly what's going on. The foreign funding and the increase in foreign students, I should add, that is what part of what is driving all of these illiberal demonstrations and vandalisms and assaults. We're importing students from places that are anti-Semitic, and we're not screening them for anything like that. So that's a huge issue when 30% of your student body is foreign, and not from places like I was a foreign student from Canada. It's other than the hockey team, it's not places like that.
okay, so this gets us to the set of questions that other people want to talk about. We had a lot of people um, send us questions about visas and the circumstance under which your visa, including your green card, can be revoked. Just as a reminder, under the Clinton administration, 12 million people were deported. George W. Bush sent out about 10 million. Barack Obama did a bunch of them. And more than half, more than 75% in some cases, never saw a judge. They were told to get out. And Jimmy Carter, as I recall, because I'm a lot older than you, Jimmy Carter revoked the visas of Iranian students after the Iranian Revolution. And he just said, well, we don't want you here. We don't need you here. Um, what's the why were they able to deport so many people? Why were they able to withdraw visas? Why did nobody seem to care about it? And Donald Trump says, well, I'm going to revoke the visas of people who do things we don't like, and I'm going to send them home. And people who are here illegally are going to be sent out, and their due process rights are somewhat different. Um, is this all just politics?
So
And
first of
what's the
all,
rule?
so first of all, the only difference between someone who has a green card, meaning permanent residency, and someone who's on a student visa or a tourist visa or a working visa or something is the process that's due. So the legal standard for getting your visa revoked, becoming removable, is the same, whether you have a green card or a student visa. The difference is the green card holder gets a lot more process. So as you said, um, you can be removed. You can just get a letter saying there's been an administrative determination that you have violated this provision and your visa has been revoked. Leave, and you don't even get 30 days. The order says you now have to leave as soon as possible. But why we're seeing all of these hearings for Mahmoud Khalil, for example, is that he does have a green card. But again, the standard that the court is looking at is whether the government can show that it's more likely than not that he violated, or any green card holder who's being deported, that they violated the provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which includes that you certify that you're not a Nazi, you're not a communist, you're not a member of an authoritarian party, you don't support terrorism, you support the violent overthrow of the U.S. government, and there's lots of other ideological tests like that. If you say at your interview with the consular office when you're applying for a student visa that you support the violent overthrow of the U.S. government, you're not going to get that visa. Similarly, if you make a speech or write a statement when you're in the U.S. that you support that, or that you are a communist or something like that, then you become removable again. And that's where a lot of these visa revocations are coming in. If you're engaged in activities, most of these are not speech claims. It's, Khalil, is one of the organizers of the group that took over Hamilton Hall at Columbia. Others, have been engaged in various other things. You don't have to be charged with a crime. But, if you're engaged in these things that violate these immigration provisions, then you can be made removable. And people ask about a Tufts grad student who co-authored an op-ed that called for divestment from Israel. I don't know why. We don't have that. There might be other evidence. That's the only thing that's public. The government doesn't have to make public what all the various allegations are. But I would hope that the government is prioritizing people that have done more than simply co-authored an op-ed. And also, I would have preferred the government to cite these kinds of provisions that I've been alluding to, rather than this discretionary catch-all where the Secretary of State can simply determine that someone is against their presence in the country is against America's interest, because that sets a precedent for future administrations who can do all sorts of different things and just deport people they don't like for various reasons. But anyway, to draw this long answer to a close, but you have to understand the nuance. Foreigners have the same speech rights as Americans. They can't be prosecuted, fined for speech we don't like, hate speech or otherwise. But they can violate immigration rules by taking certain positions, by affiliating themselves with certain ideological missions, that sort of thing. And that's the state of play.
So that was interesting because I think most people don't understand that in order to get in, you have to say certain things. And one possibility is that you answer correctly and you learn more when you get here and you change your mind. So you answered it correctly and changed your mind. And one possibility is that people lied when they got here or in order to get in here. And I think that wasn't clear how many different kinds of things you have to attest to, that you're not a Nazi, that you're not a communist, you know. And so I appreciate that because I'm pretty sure that that wasn't well understood. Um,
And sometimes it's just not vetted. Sometimes the question doesn't get asked by
oh,
the consular officer.
and if it does get asked, is it written down somewhere or is this just a conversation they have?
I I'm not familiar with the granular details there. There must be a file somewhere. It's an implicit acceptance that they've passed that they meet the threshold. Um,
Okay.
but Khalil is he's also part of why he's being removed is that it appears that he fraudulently stated certain things, didn't disclose some of his activities in England or whatever. But yeah, certainly fraud can play a role in this.
Well, that's it's interesting, and it's interesting because it's different than all the conversations we have about illegal immigrants who stack up differently than people who have come in here legally, whether they told the truth or they didn't tell the truth.
All right. Well,
Um,
the other question is, are they actually, if they're apprehended at the border, then you can just, return them immediately because
right.
the border officer sees, okay, we just return you. But if they're caught in country, then, the only claim they can make is, actually I'm a citizen or actually I'm entitled to be here. Um, so that's the only process they claim that they have.
Although, didn't President Biden allow people to enter the country illegally and then once they were here, claim asylum rights? I mean, does
Yep.
that give them different status?
Well, President Trump is allowed to revoke that grant of uh, not necessarily asylum,
Uh-huh.
although asylum too in many contexts, but of temporary protected status. And
Uh-huh.
there's ongoing litigation over that. But yes, if something is done through an administrative order, administrative orders can always be revoked.
Okay. So moving slightly to the side, um, you've written a whole lot about masking, and we've been really happy to run some of it. The ACLU said a while ago, about a year ago, that it was, quote, especially worried about the anti-masking laws because in the digital age, they were concerned that AI technology could allow you to identify people in a way that you couldn't be identified before. They said, the ACLU, I'm going to quote this, the ACLU said, it turns our faces into the functional equivalent of license plates. And therefore, masking should be allowed because people should be able to hide their identities. And if you don't mask, then AI can identify you, and then you're identified. Um, it seems to me there's something wrong with the logic. Is there
Well,
something? Is it
the
me, or is
logic
it?
is sound. It's just not based in the state of the law. Um,
That's
clearly, it
please
is
go
easier.
there.
Clearly, it is easier to be identified now than it used to be. And also, people do mask to hide their identities. But that's a problem because generally, when people are masked, with some exceptions, which are written into anti-masking laws, they're up to no good, whether it's robbing banks or terrorizing populations. And there is no right to be anonymous in public. That's There's multiple court cases holding that, upholding anti-masking laws of various kinds. Now, if you need to be masked for your occupation, construction worker with a filter for dust and what have you, for health reasons, be it, obviously we're familiar with the COVID pandemic, but there's, lots of reasons people might mask for health reasons, generally not in groups. That's, judges can probe for the sincerity of their claim, and for religious reasons. But most of these protesters are not claiming that they're required to wear hijab or something like that. In fact, there's not a religious requirement in any Islamic sect that I know, for example, that requires you to wear a kafia. There's no requirement for men to mask in any religion that I'm familiar with. So anyway, yeah, the point is there is a compelling state interest in being able to identify those who are engaged in mayhem or breaking public order or what have you. And those kinds of claims for privacy have not there's not a single court ruling that says that you have a right to do that for a reason of public anonymity.
Can you remind us why we have anti-masking laws? Can you just remind us where this
It
comes from?
started with actions against the Ku Klux Klan back in the 19th century. New York State had the oldest anti-masking law in the country going back 2 centuries. That was repealed during COVID, and there's a big debate about bringing it back. Some counties in New York have. Nassau County, I think, was the first.
Okay. So it has a history, and I think it has a history that most Americans would appreciate, that we didn't want the KKK running around hiding itself, and perhaps we don't want Hamas running around and hiding itself. Um,
Or bank robbers. I mean, we've seen an uptick
or
in
bankrupts.
burglary during the COVID era because everybody was masked.
Yeah, that's true. Not just banks, but drugstores and all kinds of
Yeah.
other things. So I think it's important to remember where this comes from. Now, in your prior book, Supreme Disorder, which I thought was great, by the way, I was trying to find a copy to hold up here, but I think I have it at, I should have known.
Here's the hard
Yes,
copy, and here
there's a
is
hard copy.
the updated paperback.
Wait, there's an updated?
Oh
I
yeah,
didn't know that. I didn't
yeah.
know that.
Through the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation.
Okay, so now I have to go get the updated one. All right, everybody buy the book, buy the updated one. Read my review anyway, but buy the updated book. You made the case in that book that a lot of our problems stem from the fact that Congress was not passing laws. And because Congress wasn't passing laws, the executive branch and the agencies and the courts create policies that aren't laws because they weren't passed as laws, but in many cases they have the force of law. Are we missing congressional action today on some of these things that are happening on college campuses? Are we missing laws? I hate to be the one that says, we need more laws in this country because I sort of think we have too many, but maybe we're missing certain laws, or are we not enforcing laws that we have?
It's not enforcing laws that we have, or rather, the universities aren't. The last Congress started oversight tied to these civil rights regulations and others, and calling up university presidents. Most famously that first panel with Claudine Gay and and Liz McGill of Penn
Right.
and Sally, what's her name of MIT. But there have been several. I mean, I think half a dozen panels or more at this point, and they're continuing, and that's good. And now the administration, the enforcement action that we discussed earlier, is based on these laws. I do think that we have all the tools that we need. For decades, those tools were not used by administrations to make universities stay on the straight and narrow.
So someone has sent in a note that says you were talking about the administration is using a sort of catch-all about people that they want to deport. Secretary of State Rubio has said, he actually said yesterday, there is information that he does not have to give out publicly and he will not give out publicly, and information that even the courts don't have to have, that he is entitled to have because he's the Secretary of State and that's present. I just thought that was interesting. Maybe the
No,
catch-all
no,
is because he,
that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. If any challenge to deportations based on that Secretary of State discretion is successful, it will not be based on judicial second guessing of the foreign policy determination. Instead, it would be based on the idea that the provision itself is overbroad or vague or doesn't provide enough standards for the Secretary of State to make that kind of determination.
here are two questions I did not expect and I still do not understand. Um, One is, and I don't know why they're asking you, what hockey position does Khomeini play? And the other is, can Iran win the Stanley Cup? I assume that has to do with you being partially Canadian.
You're not
No?
supposed to read the joke questions, Shoshana. Yeah,
Oh,
I
I'm
don't know.
not. How am I supposed to know it's a joke? I don't know what
um,
you know about hockey.
I know a lot about hockey. I'm a Capital season ticket holder, and I still am a Toronto Maple Leafs fan. I actually have uh, a dual flag on my house during NHL playoffs, during the Stanley Cup playoffs. We put out a flag that's Capitals on one side, Leafs on the other. Yeah, I'm big into hockey. I just went to the game last night, actually.
We won,
I
right?
Yeah,
Did
Capitals
we
closed
win?
out their series. They'll be playing Carolina in the second round. See, this is the kind of content why you tune in for these JPC webinars.
I
Um,
simply say you never know what you're going to get. That's all. So today we get,
Khomeini, I don't know. He's an explosive super sub. I don't know how to answer that question. Really, is he right wing, left wing? Depends on the situation. And Iran definitely cannot win the Stanley Cup because it doesn't have any teams in the NHL. So the NHL has been playing games in Europe in recent years. No games thus far are scheduled for Tehran, but it looks like that's for my colleague Charles Fame, and I'll let you know, Charles, as soon as that's scheduled. We can go on a fact finding mission together.
okay, I'm going to go back to the book because Lawless, order the book, because we're coming to the end of the program. And people who um, tune in know two things. First of all, I read the joke questions. If somebody takes the time to put them in, I read the joke questions. And the other is that we like to go out on a high note. And I have to say that you have not been very helpful in that regard up to this point. So the last question is I was sort of thumbing the book, and you have idea. As I say, I have started the book. I admit I haven't finished the whole thing. You have some ideas about what to do to make things better in the college hierarchy. So, as an out question, so that perhaps we can leave with some hope for the future, other than the fact that my kids have already graduated from college, what do we do to make it better? What are the fixes? Or where do you look for
I
fixes?
mentioned those in my opening remarks. So I'm for all of the above, and that means
Okay.
create new institutions like the University of Austin, where I spoke earlier this year. Very interesting place there, and they just have their first cohort of students, so it's all freshmen, which at least for the first 2 years, it's free tuition as they build up the place. Um, uh, other part of that, all of the above, is new centers and institutes within existing schools. So UNC, University of Florida, Arizona State, all have these new centers of excellence or civics education or classics education, however they're styled, to provide the intellectual rigor that the larger college was supposed to, but has failed at. Um, there's pressure from external sources, be that bar associations and Supreme Courts in the law school context, be it state legislatures, cutting DEI offices in public schools. There's now the federal action that we've been discussing that's the subject of national news these days. There's employers, as I said, not hiring people who sign those letters supporting Hamas, or people who were identified because of AI sometimes as engaged in violent protests. So there's a lot that can be done. It doesn't mean that all institutions are salvageable or non-salvageable. We'll have different things going on in different places, and maybe 10, 20, certainly 50 years from now, the institutional landscape will look a lot different. I'm just glad that my oldest son is 9, so we don't have to make a decision about where to send him for quite some time.
But you just said, in my opinion, the most important thing. What you're seeing now in places like Harvard and some other places is a decline in student enrollment. And families and individuals and students saying to themselves, I don't want that. And the movement of individuals, it seems to me, is really the underpinning. You can do a lot with the government and should do a lot with the government, particularly in terms of financing. Um, but each of us has to make a decision for ourselves, for our kids, in my case, for grandchildren. Um, Aren't we ultimately the arbiters of how these guys are going to go? If we don't send our kids to Harvard and our kids don't want to go to Harvard, what's Harvard going to be in 10 or 15 years?
Well, probably in Harvard's case, it's more than that because $53 billion buys you a lot of wiggle room, a lot of cushion.
Okay.
But even a place like Harvard, when applications went down 5% and donation rates, I think, of alumni went down 5%, that was enough to send off alarm bells, because that you want to nip such trends in the bud. Um, but the dynamic you express is absolutely an important one. Um, I call it the problem of the cold and the scold. So why would you go to one of these northeastern places where neither the meteorological nor ideological climate is amenable? Wouldn't it be better to go to, an SEC school, maybe go to the honors college there, have a good time while getting an education? And especially given the surveys or the studies that have shown that, if you're good enough to get into one of these so-called elite prestigious places, then your life outcome is going to be the same, regardless of whether you actually end up going there. It's whether the student is talented, not the value add that particular institution gives.
So that's our optimistic ending point, which is that students who are themselves talented and capable and ambitious and energetic and make good choices are going to be the leaders. It may not be the decision of Harvard as to who runs the country in 20 years, but the decision of individuals. I love going out on individuals. So, on the thought that we have power in our own lives, I want to say thank you very much for joining us. You've taken a conversation that is convoluted and difficult, and I think most of us don't really understand the particulars, and you've made it a lot more accessible. And for that, I thank you. Ilya, come again, please.
My pleasure. And again, both Lawless and Supreme Disorder are available on Amazon and wherever else you want to buy your books in multiple formats. If you want Audible, that's great. I can't sign an Audible book, but nonetheless, you can still have that. I think CDs are still even available, if
Really?
that's your preference, and Kindle and all this other stuff. So anyway, and Shapiro's Gavel is my Substack. So thanks very much for having me.
Shapiro's Gavel. Shapiro's Gavel. It's fabulous. Everybody do that. Do the books, but also do Shapiro's Gavel and stay right up to date every week. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ilya. I hope we'll see you again.
All right.